Okay, so I wanted to good evening, everyone. I'd like today to just finish off, in a sense, melachot grua, and then hopefully that will allow us to move on. I plan, as I mentioned in the WhatsApp group, I plan to say very little about the other Tosasim and Amud Beis. It's in a sense the Gemara drifts away from dealing with core Shabbos issues and gets into terminology and categorization questions and the like, and therefore I'm not planning to spend a lot of time on that. So I would urge everyone to use Tuesday and on to Ben Uzmanim also to try and just go through the Gemara on a Bakiyas level so that we can at the start of the new term, the new Zaman, focus. I'm just trying to find my notes. Focus on Daf Gimel and Aleph when we get back to core Shabbos issues. So that's the timeline. Today I just want to finish off Melachot Gura, which we didn't really deal with enough. I'm trying to find my handout sheets. No, I have one in which I added the Zerur, which I put in the WhatsApp group onto. So I thought I'd made to myself that sheet. Just give me a moment. Okay, here it is. Okay. Okay, so what I really want to do is just look at the Rishonim, the three explanations of the Rishonim as to what Melachot Grua means. So in the last two Shiurim, we spoke about the Psukim and why, based upon the idea of Melachot Grua, you need a pasuk and more than one pasuk for Melechas Hotzaah. So all other melachos, the 39 melachos, we just cut and paste from the Mishkan, and Melechas Hotzaah needs a pasuk, and not only does it need a pasuk, it needs two pasukim, and we saw the way the Rishonim explain why we need more than one pasuk. What I want to do today is explain what Melachot Grua is. I realized that in the last year we had never defined Melachot Grua, and there was some questioning around that and what Tosfos meant and so on. So there are three types of language used in the Rishonim to explain Melachot Grua. And I want to go in reverse order. Well, actually, we'll go in the order of the Rishonim that I gave them out. Tosfos says that the definition of Melachot Grua is the Hotzaah. This is the second wide line of Tosfos, or third wide line. It needs to tell us this because Hotzaah is a Melachot Grua. Demali moitzi mishasayachid u'shasarabim. Mali moitzi mishasayachid u'shasayachid. So Tosa says that what's weak in Hotzaah is that there doesn't seem to be a logic between distinguishing between types of reshus. If the melacha is moving from reshus to reshus, then what difference does it make moving from my reshus hayachid to your reshus hayachid, or your reshus hayachid to my reshus hayachid, or moving from reshus harabim to reshus hayachid? It seems to be the same thing. So that's Tosfos's question on Tosfos's weakness that he sees in Melechas Hotzaah. Does anyone see any problems with that? Could we find an answer to the question? Yes, Tosfos says we're trying to understand. To the best of my knowledge, it's the Bali Tosfos that introduced this terminology on Melachot Grua. The impact of the Bali Tosfos on learning Gemara is enormous. Once they introduced certain concepts, it takes over. So just do a little brief history of Torah learning, as it were. With Rashi's completion of Rashi's commentary on Shas, the whole of Gemara became much more accessible, and the Bali Tosfos launched a revolution. The students and first generation descendants of Rashi launched a revolution of Torah learning, in which they now began looking at bigger questions, the structure of Shas, comparing sugyas that seem to contradict each other and the like. And figures like the Ri and Rabbeinu Tam introduced various conceptual categories. And once they were introduced, they could never be forgotten, and they took over the Torah world. So when you learn the Rif and the Rambam, and the Gaonim, you don't see any mention of an idea like Melachot Grua. But Tosfos introduces the idea, and once it's introduced, you can never forget that terminology, and it becomes obvious that Hotzaah is different to every other Melacha, And the later generation of Rishonim all define it in different ways, but they can't remove that thought of Hotzaah being melachot grua. So here we have a very, very important line. We have Tosfos introducing a new halachic concept that you don't find in the Gemara. Nowhere's the Gemara that says Hotzaah is different, it's melachot grua. The Gemara was assuming something because the Gemara treats Hotzaah as very differently to other melachos. It brings Pesukim. We'll see in a few minutes, near the end of the Shir, about 5 examples in Shas where Hotzaah behaves very differently. I'll just run through and sort of, just to bring out the picture, where Hotzaah behaves very differently to other melachos. So the Gemara clearly has a conceptual picture of how Hotzaah is different to other melachos. Tosfos gives us the label for that conceptual difference. It calls it a melachot grua. And now Tosfos has to define in what way is it a melachot grua. Says Tosfos, if the logic of Hotzaah is moving from Rishus to Rishus, how can it be that you are only chayiv min haTorah if you move from Rishus Rabbim to Rishus Yachid, or Rishus Yachid to Rishus Rabbim, but not if you move from one Rishus Yachid to another Rishus Yachid? If I move an object from my back garden to my neighbor's back garden, min haTorah I'm not chayiv, I haven't done anything. If I move it from my back garden to the street, then I'm chayiv. How can that make a difference? Make up your mind. If the melacha is change of rishus, why should it make a difference if it's rishus rabbim to rishus yachid, or rishus yachid to rishus rabbim, or if it's between one rishus yachid and another rishus yachid? That's Tosfos's definition of the weakness of Hotzaah. Why it's a strange melacha. It doesn't seem to have an outcome which can be clearly defined, because if the definition is moving rishus to rishus, then mali rishus yachid rishus rabbim, mali rishus yachid rishus yachid. Is that?
But Tufot himself seems to take place in the Mishkan. He has all this example of Krashim, etc. You can't get all of the examples from that necessarily, but essentially it's in the Mishkan.
True, and therefore,
why do we need Pesukim?
Because not everything that takes place in the Mishkan should be defined as a melacha. There has to be an outcome that's significant, and the outcome has to have a logic to it. The whole of Masechet Shabbat is a meeting of human reason with what we learn from the Mishkan. Let me say the following. In the Mishkan, those carrying the Keroshim were Leviim. Does that mean that on Shabbos you should only be chayiv if you're a Levi? In the Mishkan, they were in the desert. Maybe only if you do melachos in the desert should you be chayiv on Shabbos. In the Mishkan, those constructing things were called Betzalel and Uri and Chur and Ariav and Bechachmei Lev. Does that mean only if you have those names? In the Mishkan, they lived 3,500 years ago, maybe only people 3,500 years ago. So what we cut and paste from the Mishkan has to have a logic to it. We're trying to look at significant outcomes. In the Mishkan, presumably people sneezed occasionally or coughed. Does that mean that sneezing and coughing on Shabbos is asa? You can't just cut and paste in the Mishkan. There has to be a clear construction outcome which we're cutting and pasting from the Mishnah. And therefore, what we're bothered by here is, just because Hotzaah took place in the Mishkan doesn't mean we know how to cut and paste it to the world of melachos. I just want to finish this because I want to align it with a lot of other ideas we said. When we learnt Klal Gadol, Daf Ayin Gimel, we saw there a list of melachos, and we discussed there, is this a list of melachos in the Mishkan or a list of human-centric melachos? To make something a melacha, you need 2 things. You need it to have appeared in the Mishkan, but also to be a significant human outcome. And sometimes there's a difference between the two. In the Mishkan, it might have been boiling that was the melacha, bishul, and in bishul samamonim perhaps, and in human list of melachos, it may be baking, afiyah, which is the equivalent, because baking bread is more significant. We saw Tosfos that discussed, the Gemara asks, why is it broken down into 3 melachos? There are 3 melachos that are associated with purifying things, sieving things. There's sieving, and there's meraked, and right? Are these 1 melachos or 3 melachos? So in each case, you have to ask yourself, how did it manifest in the Mishkan, and then how did it manifest in human achievement? And what we're bothered by over here is, it's true that carrying objects took place in the Mishnah, but does that make it a melacha or not? Sorry, Gary.
Just with praise, the Gemara so far has not referred to what the source was in the Mishkan.
Yes.
And that could relate to the answer to the question about Hotzaah. What happened in the Mishkan was it carrying you said with Krashim or putting them on the Akala?
Yeah. Let me stop you because I addressed this a little bit in the last chair. And I don't want to go into it because Gemara doesn't address exactly how the melacha manifested in the Mishnah. It clearly is linked. You're clearly correct that the Gemara here isn't explaining to us the origin of the melacha. In fact, we saw in the last year a possibility that until we discover that Hotzaah has a tolda, Zorek, we don't even realize it's a melacha. We think it's just learned from these pesukim. And when it says chayiv and potter, either it means that you're chayiv for doing something that's not a melacha on Shabbos, or it just means makas. Who knows? So you are correct. There's something it's very interesting that the Gemara starts with Masechet Shabbat without having told us any other melachos. Tosfos, the first Tosfos addressed it, and without telling us the origins of this. And it only really discusses the source of this only much later in the Masechta when it deals with it having a tolden. It says, oh, if it has a tolden, then it must be an Av Melacha. Where do we know it's an Av Melacha from? All of that, though, I want to push to the side because in a sense, that's listen to the previous shiurim, how the psukim work, how the melachot works. In this year, I just want to deal with the pristine issue that we missed out of when Tosfos, for all these problems, tells us a new concept, a concept that originated in the mind of the Ri, and it's not something that you find in Gaonim or the Rambam or the Rif or Shas, that Hotzaah is a melacha gura. There's something unusual about, inferior about Hotzaah. In what way is it inferior? And that's all I'm focusing on now. And what is inferior about the melacha? And Tosfos says his view of what's inferior, that it doesn't make sense, that it should make a difference between one Rishus and another Rishus, and yet not. Yeah.
So in that answer that question on Tosfot, a possible answer, why
Yes.
Hayachid to Hayachid wouldn't be a significant agenda. I think maybe it is to do with the outcome that when you move from a rabbin to a Hayachid or vice versa, you're moving from an area where it's available to an unlimited number of people to an area where it's a limited number of people.
Yeah, I think that's correct. We could argue with Tosfos. We could say that we do hear an intuition of a difference between Rishus Yochid and Rishus Rabbim, and Rishus Yochid and Rishus Yochid, and we'll have to get to that. Clearly, there's a difference. I defined Rishus Yochid as the place where we consume objects or use them, and Rishus Rabbim is the place where we transport objects. You can hear that that's a more significant shift, and we'll have to see in Tosfos why he says not like that. Sorry, Cohen, is that what the point you wanted to make? Or yeah.
Also, it's not a link to position. That things in the are generally mine.
Yes.
And things in the are rather not generally have got anyone else's. So there's a sort of a link to potentially a Kenyan issue going on.
I don't know if it's correct that it's not mine. I mean, it's true that if you have, I don't know, a lamppost in Rishus Rabbim or something like that, but movable objects in Rishus Rabbim normally have owners. But I think ownership is the intuition of coming from is correct, but I think ownership is a blind alley, to use that term. I think it's about usefulness and relationship to it. An object of Rishus Yochid, my relationship is that of using it and consuming it. That an object of Rishus Rabbim, my relationship is that of transporting it and moving it to get to another place of use and functionality. Yeah. Okay, so we'll have to come back to that, why Tosfos does think that this difference is strange, but that's what Tosfos says. Now, the Ramban and the Rashba and the like, they say different language. Let's just look at the Ramban, but they all use this language. I printed this in bold. It's on source 2, the Ramban. In the slightly larger font handout sheet. And he says this is the near the end of the first bold section in the Ramban. V'im Toma, Kroi Gefai Lomali. Why do I need the psukim? Sriche, you do need the psukim. Tzalkadata Chamina. I would have thought Hotzaah Chidushu. Hotzaah is a Kiddush. Shebeshus Hayochin Mutzer Lissa Masa Kodol. In Rishus Hayochin, you're allowed to carry a great weight. The Mahotzer Rishus Rabbim could Gergeres Chayiv. And yet, if you carry out to Rishus Rabbim even a Gergeres, a date, then you're Chayiv. Vashenke B'Shalvis Menachos She'enim Chalukas B'Shus Elisur Machmas Atzman. Their baron halachas, they can't learn from each other. And you can't extrapolate from one scenario of Hotzaah to another because it's such a weird melacha that we don't know how to extrapolate it. It's not a melacha that makes sense. Now, in some respects, the Ramban and the Rashba are very similar to Tosfos. They're also picking up on the feature that with Hotzaah you are chayav only when you go from Rishus Yochid to Rishus Rabbim, and with other melachos we don't find that the Rishus makes a difference. But the emphasis, Tosfos seems to be saying, I get it that Hotzaah is moving from one Rishus to another Rishus. I just don't understand why there's a difference between moving from Rishus Yochid to Rishus Rabbim and from one Rishus Yochid to another Rishus Yochid. Tosfos seems to say, I would get it why I'm allowed to move an object. I can move my pen from this corner of the room to that corner of the room. What I'm bothered by is, if you can't move it from Rishus Yochid to Rishus Rabbim, why can I move it from my house to your house? From one Rishus Yochid to another Rishus Yochid. The Ramban seems to be saying, and perhaps reading that into Tosfos, that's not the point. The point is, how can it be that on Shabbos I can spend the whole of Shabbos schlepping weightlifting and schlepping heavy furniture on my back from one end of the room to the other room, and at least as far as, it may not be Shabbosdik, it's not appropriate to do it, certainly Rabbanon also, it's a techa, but as far as the melachos are concerned, I've done zero melacha, and yet I carry a bean from one rishus to another rishus, and I'm chayev. So the Ramban's emphasis is that the melacha seems to be masa, weight carrying, and I don't understand why baking doesn't make a difference whether I bake in rishus yachid to rishus rabim, yet weight carrying does make a difference between carrying from rishus rabim to rishus yachid. That's how the Ramban says it. Now, everyone with me? Now, the cleanest formulation I want to say is, I say cleanest in the sense that it seems to cut to the heart of the issue and strip away anything else, is the Ozura that I put on the WhatsApp group. Ozura is a relatively late Rishon, based in Vienna. And he's Ashkenazi, a student of the students of the Baalei Tosfos, is nearing the end of the very innovative phase of Baalei Tosfos, and he's moving towards taking Tosfos principles and applying them on Halacha. So the Ozura is a halachic work, but representing the thinking of the schools of the Baalei Tosfos. And he picks up on the same point as all the other Rishonim, and he just says a very crisp formulation. Mishum to melacha she'ein chashuvahi to ma melacha also she'etzim rishus me'kar chayfet v'hashanami chayfet. So very clear words. He says, what malacha have I done at all? Originally it was an object, and now it's an object. I haven't changed the object at all. I've simply moved location. How is location a malacha? This, by the way, I accidentally slipped into using this terminology right at the beginning of malacha grua, because in my mind it's ozura, but I shouldn't have done that, because the different Rishonim say different formulations. But the ozura says that the chiddush of Hotzaah is I've done nothing to the object. When I bake something, it goes from raw to baked. When I weave threads together, it goes from threads to cloth. When I move an object, I've made no change in the object whatsoever, and that's the aspect of Hotzaah, that's Melachot Grua. So these are the three paths we find in the Rishonim. Now, I want to step out of this and say that there are two intuitions that lie behind these three paths. Is everyone with me so far? Yeah. So there are three ways of saying the svara. Either Rishus Yachid, Rishus Yachid, how can there be different Rishus Yachid, Rishus Rabim? I get it that change of Rishus matters, but what type of Rishus? Second svara is, what difference does it make change of Rishus at all? It's just masa, it's schlepping, that's the malacha. And the third is there's no change in the chayfet. There are two ways, in a sense, of saying, so what is the malacha at the end of the day? In other words, the malacha gurua, but what can we say about the malacha? And again, I in previous shiurim, I blurred these, and I just want to unpick this. One answer to the question is that unlike other malachas, it's not about the result, it's about the action. That would be a good answer to the question. The Ramban's language edges us towards thinking about that. It's about muscle, it's about carrying a burden rather than an outcome. And that's what's unique about Melacha Sotzah. Maybe Makib Patish is similar, that again, it's not an outcome defined Melacha, it's about engagement, expertise, we saw craftsmanship or the like, but let's not worry about Makib Patish. So one answer would be that the chiluk is Maisa versus Totzah. All Melachas have to achieve Totzah's outcomes, and Hotzaah is about a movement and an action. That's one way of thinking about it. An alternative way of thinking about it is that it's about the nature of the outcome. Of course, Hotzaah has an outcome, but it's not an objective outcome, it's a subjective outcome. It's what I called a melacha mitzad the gavra, as opposed to a melacha mitzad the chayfetz. Melacha mitzad the chayfetz means the object, there's an objective external change in the object. Here, the changes in my relationship to the object. Having objects in different locations alters my relationship to it. So it's about my subjective relationship to the object. It's a change in the object, but a change in the object as it subjectively applies to me, as opposed to a change in the object as it objectively applies to the object. Now we can say both paths in all the Rishonim. In other words, this is a conceptual debate that doesn't translate neatly across to the language of the Rishonim. So, for example, in the Ozura says, what outcome is there? So what's the answer to the questions? The Ozura raises the weakness of the Melech of Hotzaah. But what is the answer? In what way is there an outcome that happens? What is the Melacha? So either you could say the Ozura says, there is no outcome, it's just about my action. That's the answer to the question. That's why it's a Melacha Grua. Or you could say, of course I recognize there's an outcome, but it's different to all other outcomes because it's not an outcome in the Chayfetz, it's an outcome in my relationship to the Chayfetz. Okay. The Ramban who says Masa, you could say the Ramban means it's different to all other melachas. It's about the action, not the result. Or you could say the Ramban means something more subtle. When you make an object into a masa, you are affecting a change in your relationship to the object. Because the object is now a masa, a burden to be moved from A to B, rather than a functional object. Even again, if it's just my pen in my house, or let's use a non-box example, it's just my plate. When I put the plate down, I'm having the plate because I wish it to be there. When I'm carrying the plate from one end of the dining room table to the other, it's in transport. We don't think of it in transport like that. We think of transport as logistics and lorries. But when it's moving from one end of the table to the other, it temporarily becomes a muscle. It temporarily becomes an object not wanted where it is, but in transport to arrive at where it is wanted. So maybe the Ramban, when he says muscle, also means a change in the chayvet, not a physical objective change in the chayvet, but a change in how I'm relating and using the chayvet. In that sense, a change in the chayvet. So the Ramban could mean muscle as weightlifting. It's the physical action. Or he could mean muscle also conceptually as affecting a change in the object. And finally, in Tosfos, Tosfos says, I don't understand the difference between Rishos Rabbim and Rishos Yachid, and Rishos Yachid and Rishos Yachid, to which you both asked, well, of course there's a difference. Maybe that's again Tosfos' point. Maybe Tosfos' point is, no, I don't agree with you. It's true that on an external level, Rishos Rabbim is the place of transport, and Rosh Hashanah is the place of use. But even within Rosh Hashanah, Mani Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Hashanah, if I move from one Rosh Hashanah to another Rosh Hashanah, at least from my subjective point of view, the object is in transport. If I have the object in my house and I want to give it to my neighbour's house, I cease to want the object to be a vehicle of consumption or use, and I want the object to be a means of giving to someone else. So again, let me just use an analogy. I hope this doesn't confuse you from a very, very different area of halacha. A clay achila, an object, a plate or a knife needs tefillah in a mikveh, right? If it's non-Jewish manufacturing, it needs tefillah in a mikveh. Okay. What happens if I sell plates? Can I tovel all my plates in advance so that the consumer doesn't have to tovel them? The answer is no, because while the plates are sitting in my shop or my warehouse, they are not clay achila, they're clay schura. They are merchandise. They're not clay achila, they're not eating utensils, they're merchandise. I have no intention of eating on them. I don't want to eat on them. On the contrary, it would devalue them. I want them as merchandise. So they are different sorts of object. Are you with me? There were poskim hold, by the way, that restaurants and caterers don't need to tovel their kelim. Why not? Because from the perspective of the Jewish restaurant owner who is taking manufactured kelim in China, they're not clay achila, they're clay schora. It's a bit more of a subtle svara at this point, okay? But you can hear that argument. There are poskim that claim that if I send Mishloach Manos to someone in a wrapped glass jar, I can't tovel it on behalf of the recipient. Because from my point of view, it's a matana, it's not clay achila. So again, the arguments become more subtle, but let's take the easiest example, the shopkeeper. You can hear that it's a clay schora. So again, I'm just using this as an analogy of how you can hear that if I take my object, and Tosfos is asking, even move it from one Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah to another Rosh Hashanah, from my point of view, there's a Hotzaah, a result happening that the object is being... So I'm trying to bring out that all three Rishonim could be conceptually much more similar than we realize. Even though they're using different vocabulary and bringing out different features, it's not obvious to me conceptually that that they are on a different page. They may all mean a melach mitzad the Maisa, that this is different to all other melachos, that it's about my action rather than the result, or they may all mean result, and they're simply pointing out that it's different to other results, and that's not an objective result, it's a subjective result, or a result that's changing it from being a useful object to a transporting object, an object in its transport mode as opposed to an object in its use mode. Are you with me in this? Yeah. I will say I had the privilege of learning Masechet Shabbat under my Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Zobin, who has I don't know, 30, 40 pages on melachot chaburah at the beginning of his sefer, and he was very convinced, for lots and lots of reasons, that actually everyone agrees that Hotzaah is like all other melachos. It's a melacha mitzad Hotzaah. It's a melacha from the perspective of the result, not just an action, not just a ma'isa, but what the Rishonim are saying is that it's a weaker result because it's a Hotzaah mitzad the gavra, not a Hotzaah mitzad the chayvet. I'm not going to go into why he's convinced of that, but I just want to bring out the concept. Let me just use the last few moments just to mention just this. This is an array of other places in Masechet Shabbat where we see Hotzaah behaving differently to other melachos, just to try and give you an indication of where melachot chaburah can take us. And this is not my own homework. I took this largely from Rabbizobin and others who have done the hard work of collating, people that know Shabbos much better than I do and therefore capable of collating it. There is a machlokus rishonim whether Masechet Shabbat applies to melachos Hotzaah. Let me explain what I mean. The halacha is that if there's subtleties in the halacha, but broadly speaking, in certain circumstances, if someone is mechalel Shabbos and cooks food for me, for example, on Shabbos, I'm not allowed to benefit from it. Why? Because the object, this delicious cooked food, came into existence through the melacha. The result lives in the object. It was raw meat, and now it's cooked meat. So the result lives in the object. The object is now cooked meat, and I can't benefit from the melacha. What happens with Hotzaah? If I have a plate in your house and I want it in my house, and someone in breach of the laws of Shabbos takes the plate from your house to my house through a Rishos Rabbim, am I allowed to use the plate? So you could argue no, because I'm benefiting from the result in the object that's changed. But you could argue yes, because there is no result, or at least no significant result, or only a subjective result in the chayvet, and therefore the concept of Masechet Shabbat, that the result of a melacha I can't benefit from the result of melacha, doesn't make sense in melachot Hotzaah. If someone weaves threads into cloth and sews the cloth into clothing, I can't wear that clothing because it's Masechet Shabbat. With Hotzaah, what result is it? It's the same object before and afterwards, as the Azarel said. So in what way can I argue that the object has been produced or manufactured through this melacha such that it would be prohibited? Are you with me? Does this make sense? Yeah? Okay, so this is one nafkamina. I'll mention another very interesting nafkamina. We've learnt before, that those who have only joined the chaburah recently will be less familiar with this. We've learned before that all melachos have to be mitkayem. There has to be some degree of permanence to the result. Does that apply to melachos Hotzaah? Well, again, one of the scenarios Tosfos brought, I don't know if you looked up every scenario, one of the scenarios Tosfos brought is a case where you throw something from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, and it traverses Rosh Hashanah. How permanent is that outcome? Very impermanent. It's literally just flowing across there. Nonetheless, that's called the melacha. So the permanence of with everything else, if I write letters in fading ink, in ink that will fade within 5 hours, that's not a permanent enough outcome in the world. Do you remember we learned the Mishnah by Kosev of mitkayem? The melacha has to be mitkayem, has to have some degree of permanence. Why? Because the chashivas of melacha is of effective a change in the world. How does that translate across to melachos Hotzaah? Not as clear cut as we might think. Now again, you could quibble with this. You could say there is a permanence because in ending up in the other rishus, in a sense, it's permanently been through a rishus harabim, so it's a different quality of flavor of permanence. Again, imagine the scenario: I pick up an object, I move it through a rishus harabim, and I put it down back in another rishus yachid. In a case where I'm chayiv for that, not every case where you chayiv for that. So you could say, in what way am I chayiv for that? It hasn't permanently been in the rishus harabim. You see, Hotzaah is different to all other melachos, and that even impermanence is enough. Or you could argue there's a different quality of permanence here because it used the Rosh Hashanah to get to the other Rosh Hashanah. Okay, interesting, something to speculate about. It may be that with Hotzaah there's no din of makalkel. Every other melacha, if you ruin something, that's not the melacha. So if I ruin something by doing, we spoke about, I don't know, moichik, where I erase the letters and I just lose information. A machikos seems to be a kilkul. You've lessened the information in the world. Or korea, tearing something seems to be a kilkul. So we said the answer, you've ruined something. So he says, how is tearing or erasing lettering a melacha? Only in a case where it's not makalkel. What would be an example of where it's not makalkel? Where I'm separating the cloth in order to resew it better. Or I'm erasing something so I have a blank piece of paper to use to write. If I just want to erase something because I don't want that information in the world, that would be makalkel. We don't find such halachas with Masechet Shabbat, with Hotzaah. If I take an object from a useful place to a horrible space, we were just in Morocco when we went to visit a tannery. This is the example used by the postscript. Smelly, horrible place. I take an object to a filthy place where I can't use it, I'm then the less chayiv in Shabbos. We don't find that there's a concept of makalkel, even though I've degraded the usefulness of the object. Okay, interesting ideas. I'll finish with one more. We discussed shiurim of melachos many moons back. Every melacha has to have a certain measure to be significant. Right? If I cook a crumb, it may not be enough for the melacha of bishul. If I walk in the street and there's a bit of dust on my clothing, I haven't done melachos Hotzaah. We saw that there's a number of ways of thinking about these measures. All I will point out is that Hotzaah is unique amongst the melachos in that besides having objective shiurim, it also has subjective shiurim. So if I cook less than a kazayas, let's say, I cook a crumb, but for me it's really important because I really want that crumb, I'm still part of from bishul. Bishul has to be objectively, have I cooked a significant quantity of food? When it comes to melachos Hotzaah, even though there are measures given for Hotzaah, if for me, there's a reason why I want this smaller object to go from place A to B, even though it's less than the normal share, I'm chayiv with melachos Hotzaah, because for me it is a chashivas. And again, that ties into what we're talking about, that maybe there's something more subjective about the Hotzaah of Hotzaah than the result of melachos Hotzaah than with other melachos. Okay, so we'll stop here for today. I would urge everyone, if this or the previous shiurim are overwhelming, please listen to the recordings. There's no way to simplify what's quite a vexing topic, quite a challenging topic to get our heads around. But anyway, I hope that makes things a little bit clearer in terms of learning. Let me just turn it over 1 second.
No shield.